The room was silent, save for the steady hum of the old ceiling fan slicing through the thick, stagnant air. Lucy lay on her bed, the glow of her phone illuminating her pale face as she scrolled through a thread of eerie bedtime stories. She didn't believe in such tales, of course. They were just the digital campfire whispers of strangers, entertaining but harmless. Her fingers hesitated over a title, The Watcher in the Dark. It was flagged with dozens of comments claiming it was cursed, a story so unnerving it left readers sleepless. Intrigued, Lucy tapped the link. The screen flickered as if the phone itself were reluctant to display the text. The story was simple, yet unnerving. It told of a shadowy figure, a watcher, who appeared at night when one was most vulnerable, lying in bed. He didn't come for everyone, only those who read the story aloud before sleeping. Once summoned, he would stand silently at the foot of the bed, watching. His presence wouldn't kill or harm, but it would leave a lasting mark, the knowledge that you were never truly alone. Lucy chuckled nervously. How ridiculous, she muttered to herself. Still, a faint chill prickled her skin. She decided to read it aloud, half as a joke and half to prove she wasn't scared. Her voice wavered slightly as she narrated the Watcher's slow approach, the way his form seemed to blend with the darkness, how his breath would linger on the edge of perception. She finished the story with an exaggerated sigh and tossed her phone onto the nightstand. "See? Nothing," she announced to the empty room, though her heart was beating faster than she cared to admit. She turned off the lamp, plunging the room into an oppressive blackness. Minutes ticked by, and Lucy tossed and turned, trying to shake the sense of unease. The room felt colder now, the fan's gentle hum drowned by a heavy silence. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes adjusting to the dark, when she noticed something off. The shadows seemed thicker than usual, denser. Her pulse quickened as her gaze settled on a shape at the foot of her bed. At first, she convinced herself it was the chair by the window, but the shape was wrong. It was taller, its edges sharper, and it seemed to sway faintly, as though breathing. "Hello?" Lucy's voice cracked in the stillness. No answer came. She reached for her phone, desperate for light, but the device refused to turn on. The figure remained motionless, but Lucy could feel its attention, like an icy hand pressing against her chest. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the shadow leaned forward, its head tilting in a gesture that felt almost curious. Lucy's entire body froze, paralyzed by an instinctive terror she couldn't suppress. Its outline grew clearer in the faint moonlight. A gaunt figure, impossibly tall, with hollow pits where eyes should have been. Those voids seemed to draw her in, drowning her in darkness. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps as she squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would vanish. She counted silently, clinging to the idea that this was all a trick of her overactive imagination. When she finally opened her eyes, the figure was closer, standing at her bedside now, its shadow stretching across her chest like a living thing. It bent lower, so close she could feel the air grow colder around her face. Lucy wanted to run, to leap from the bed and flee, but her body betrayed her. She could only lie there, trembling as it raised a skeletal hand. The tips of its fingers hovered inches from her face, and though it never touched her, Lucy swore she felt its presence sinking into her skin, burrowing into her mind. And then it spoke, not aloud, but inside her head, a voice like grinding stones and distant thunder. "You summoned me." Lucy didn't remember falling asleep, but when she woke, the room was as it had been, quiet, still, and unassuming. The morning light filtered through the curtains, dispelling the shadows. Relief washed over her, followed by a wave of embarrassment. It had to have been a nightmare. A very vivid, very terrifying nightmare. She grabbed her phone to check the time, her heart stopping when she saw the screen. It was on now, the battery at 100%. But the wallpaper had changed. The cheerful photo of her dog was gone, replaced by a dark image of her room at night. Her bed, her face frozen mid-scream, and in the corner of the frame, the Watcher loomed. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight as Sarah settled into her favorite armchair. The house was quiet, save for the faint creaks of old wood and the wind rattling against the windows. She flipped through the pages of an old leather-bound book she'd found at a second-hand shop earlier that day. Its title, The Whispers Between Walls, was embossed in faded gold, and the first few pages bore strange, handwritten notes in a language she didn't recognize. She was drawn to it immediately, though she couldn't explain why. The shopkeeper had warned her with a sly smile that the book was unpredictable. But Sarah assumed he was just trying to add a spooky allure to sell it. Now, alone in her living room, the book felt heavier, the pages colder to the touch than they should have been. The stories inside were chilling, tales of haunted houses, spectral figures, and malevolent forces lurking in the mundane. But one story stopped her cold. The Echo Room. It described a phenomenon where certain houses, built on cursed ground, absorbed the essence of those who had lived and died within. Over time, these echoes became sentient, able to manipulate the living. Sarah's breath caught as she read a passage describing the signs of such a house. Doors that wouldn't stay closed, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and whispers at night that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She thought back to the past few nights in her own home, the way her bedroom door always swung open no matter how tightly she latched it, the shadow she dismissed as her imagination, the faint murmurs she'd attributed to her noisy neighbors. A sudden thud from the hallway made her jump, the book slipping from her hands. Her head whipped toward the sound. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. Her heart pounded as she stood and walked toward the source of the noise. The hallway was dark, the single bulb above flickering erratically. She noticed the door to the guest room was ajar, though she was certain she'd closed it earlier. Pushing it open, she peered inside. The room was empty, but the air felt wrong. Thick, almost electric. She was about to turn back when she noticed something strange. The full-length mirror on the wall seemed darker than it should have been, as if the reflection didn't quite match the dim light of the room. Stepping closer, she hesitated. Her reflection stood perfectly still, even as she shifted nervously on her feet. A chill ran down her spine when she realized the figure in the mirror was smiling. She wasn't. The grin widened unnaturally, splitting the reflection's face as if its skin were tearing. Sarah stumbled back, crashing into the dresser. The mirror rattled, but didn't fall. Her reflection moved now, stepping closer to the glass, its hands pressing against the inside as if trying to push through. "No, this isn't real," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But the reflection laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that filled the room. Then it spoke, its voice layered with her own, and something deeper, guttural. "You brought us here, Sarah. You opened the door." She turned and bolted, slamming the guest room door behind her and sprinting down the hallway. The house seemed alive now. The walls groaned and the shadows writhed. From every corner, whispers rose, unintelligible but insistent. She reached the living room and grabbed her phone, fumbling to call someone, anyone, but the screen wouldn't respond. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, until they became a deafening roar. "Leave me alone," she screamed, clutching her head. The noise stopped. The silence was suffocating. Then, from directly behind her, a voice whispered, "We're already inside." She spun around, but the room was empty. Her chest heaved as she backed away, her foot catching on something. She glanced down and saw the book lying open on the floor. The words on the page were no longer the story she had been reading. Instead, they spelled out a single, chilling sentence. "Your house is the echo now." The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The road stretched endlessly before Ben, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through the forest. His car headlights barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, and the hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the eerie silence. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 1:13 a.m. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, leaving him to follow instinct and faintly marked road signs. Ben cursed himself for taking the detour. He should have stuck to the highway, but the thought of shaving an hour off his trip had been too tempting. Now, he was lost in the middle of nowhere, his fuel gauge teetering dangerously close to empty. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught a figure standing on the side of the road. A woman, her pale face illuminated in the glow, wearing a white dress that seemed too clean for someone out here. Ben slowed the car, unease gnawing at him, but his sense of decency won out. He rolled down the window as he pulled alongside her. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" he asked, his voice cautious. The woman turned her head slowly, her expression blank but her eyes intense. She nodded and walked to the passenger side without a word. Ben unlocked the door and she slid in silently. Her dress rustled like dry leaves. "Where are you headed?" Ben asked, trying to keep his tone light. She didn't respond. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The air in the car grew colder, and Ben resisted the urge to glance at her again. Something about her presence made his skin crawl. "Look, I can drop you off at the next gas station or—" "Keep driving," she said suddenly, her voice soft but commanding. Ben froze for a moment, startled by her tone. Against his better judgment, he obeyed, his foot pressing the gas pedal. The road seemed darker now, the trees pressing closer, their twisted branches forming jagged silhouettes. Minutes passed in tense silence before she spoke again. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked, her voice distant, as if she were speaking to someone far away. "What?" Ben glanced at her, but her face was still turned toward the windshield. "Second chances. Do you believe people deserve them?" she repeated, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress tightly now. Ben swallowed hard. "I guess it depends on the person," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Why?" She turned to him then, and he nearly swerved off the road. Her eyes were empty pits, black voids that seemed to swallow the dim light inside the car. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her hollow eyes. "I didn't get one," she whispered. Ben slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. He turned to face her fully, heart pounding, but the passenger seat was empty. The door was still locked. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he scanned the road around him, but there was no sign of her. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, the static deafening. Over the noise, a voice emerged. Hers. "You shouldn't have stopped." The car's headlights flickered, and in the brief flashes of light, Ben saw figures standing in the woods on either side of the road. Dozens of them. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, just like hers. They watched him silently, their forms barely visible in the strobe-like flicker of the lights. Panicked, Ben floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The radio continued to spew static, and his headlights dimmed further with each passing second. He didn't care where he was going anymore. He just needed to get away. But the road didn't end. It twisted and turned, always the same, the forest pressing closer. The figures appeared again and again, standing just at the edges of the trees and all their heads turning to watch him as he passed. The woman's voice echoed inside the car, though the radio was now dead. "You can't outrun us." The engine sputtered, and Ben's stomach dropped as the car rolled to a stop. He tried the ignition, but it was useless. He sat frozen, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The woman was there, sitting in the back seat, her empty eyes meeting his. "You should have kept driving," she said, leaning closer. Her cold breath brushed against his neck. Ben screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. The next morning, a state trooper found his car abandoned on the side of the road, the driver's seat empty. The doors were locked, and the keys were still in the ignition. The only clue was a faint handprint on the inside of the passenger window, too small and delicate to have been Ben's. The night was unusually quiet when Emma moved into the small apartment on the edge of town. It was an old building, the kind with creaky floors and chipped paint, but it was cheap, and that's all she needed while starting over. The landlord had warned her about the building's quirks, the occasional plumbing issue, thin walls, but he had failed to mention one thing. The door to the hall closet wouldn't stay shut. It was small at first. She'd close the door before bed, only to find it slightly ajar in the morning. A draft, she thought. Old buildings do strange things. But after a few nights, it began to bother her. One evening, as she sat on her couch with a glass of wine, she noticed the door creak open slowly, inch by inch. She stared at it, her skin prickling. She walked over, pushed it shut firmly, and even jammed a chair against the knob. That would do it, she thought. At 3:07 a.m., Emma woke to a soft click. She sat up, her heart racing in the darkness, and looked toward the closet. The chair had been pushed aside, and the door stood wide open. The darkness inside seemed impossibly deep, as though it wasn't just a closet, but a void. Emma tried to rationalize it in the morning. Maybe the chair slipped. Maybe she hadn't wedged it as tightly as she thought. Still, the unease lingered. That evening, she taped the door shut with several layers of duct tape, ensuring it wouldn't budge. But at 3:07 a.m. again, she woke to the sound of tape ripping. Her throat tightened as she stared at the door, now slightly open. She could barely breathe as she got up, trembling, and slammed it shut again. This time, she placed a heavy bookshelf in front of it, barricading it entirely. For the next 2 nights, the door stayed shut. She began to relax, convincing herself that whatever had happened was just a fluke. On the 3rd night, however, she woke not to a sound, but to a feeling, an overwhelming sense that something was in the room with her. Her eyes darted to the closet. The bookshelf had been moved aside, and the door was open just enough to reveal a sliver of black. Emma's chest tightened as she reached for her phone to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the closet. There was nothing there, just the usual stack of boxes and old coats she hadn't unpacked yet. She exhaled shakily, got out of bed, and approached the door, gripping her phone tightly. She swung the door open wide, determined to face whatever irrational fear had gripped her. The closet was empty, but as she turned to go back to bed, she froze. Something was wrong. The coats hanging on the rod, she was certain she hadn't packed any red ones. And the box in the corner, she didn't own anything that looked like a wooden crate. Emma's blood ran cold when she realized the crate had markings carved into its side, symbols that seemed to twist and writhe when she looked at them too long. Her phone flickered, its flashlight dimming as the closet seemed to grow darker. A faint whisper began to seep from the crate, a sound so soft it was almost inaudible, yet it filled her head like a scream. She stumbled backward, slamming the door shut, and ran to the kitchen. She spent the rest of the night huddled there, the light on, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. The next day, Emma called the landlord, her voice shaking as she demanded answers about the apartment. He sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice," he said. "Notice what?" Emma hissed. "The closet," he replied. "It's old, older than the building itself. Tenants have always complained about it. Doors opening, strange noises, but nothing ever serious." "Serious?" Emma shouted. "It's not just opening doors. There's something in there." The landlord hesitated. "If you want to break the lease, I understand. But if you stay, just don't open the crate." Emma hung up, furious and terrified. That night, she tried to ignore the closet entirely, barricading it once again. She left every light in the apartment on and curled up on the couch, clutching a knife. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the lights flickered and the apartment went silent. Emma sat frozen in the darkness as the familiar creak of the closet door echoed through the room. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she turned her head toward the sound. The door was wide open. The crate was gone. And then she felt it. A breath on the back of her neck. A voice, low and guttural, whispered into her ear, "You opened the door. Now we've opened yours." Emma's scream was cut short, swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, the apartment was empty, save for the red coat hanging in the closet. The storm rolled in without warning, drenching the narrow highway and forcing Leah to pull her car to the side of the road. The rain was so heavy she could barely see past her windshield, even with the wipers on high. Her GPS had lost signal miles ago and her phone battery was down to 5%. She cursed her bad luck, but reassured herself that once the storm eased up, she'd find her way back to the main road. As she waited, lightning illuminated the dense forest surrounding her. In one bright flash, she noticed a sign just ahead, barely visible through the downpour. It read, "Willow Hollow, 2 miles." It wasn't on her map, but maybe she could find shelter there. She didn't have many options. The town appeared sooner than she expected. It was unsettlingly quiet, its narrow streets lined with weathered, Victorian-style homes. Most of them were dark, their windows shuttered, but a single building near the center of the town glowed with warm, inviting light. A wooden sign above the door swayed in the wind. The Hollow Inn. Leah parked in front and hurried inside. The scent of old wood and lavender greeted her as she stepped into the cozy lobby. A woman stood behind the counter, her gray hair pinned into a tight bun. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Caught in the storm, dear?" the woman asked. "Yes," Leah replied, shivering. "Do you have any rooms available?" "Of course. You're the first guest we've had in some time." The woman handed her a brass key, its surface worn smooth. "Room 7, top of the stairs, end of the hall." Leah thanked her and made her way upstairs. The inn was eerily silent, the creak of the wooden steps echoing loudly in the emptiness. Her room was simple but clean, with a 4-poster bed and a small desk beneath the window. She set her bag down and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion overtaking her. As she drifted off, she thought she heard faint laughter coming from somewhere below. It was muffled, almost like children playing, but it stopped as abruptly as it had started. She woke a few hours later to the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and too close. They were in the hallway, just outside her door. Her heart pounded as she stared at the crack beneath the door, waiting for a shadow to pass, but none did. "Hello," she called out hesitantly. The footsteps stopped. She held her breath, straining to listen, but the silence pressed against her ears like a physical weight. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it, until the faintest of whispers reached her. "Leave." Leah jumped up and swung the door open, but the hallway was empty. The wooden floorboards were dry, showing no signs of anyone having been there. Her stomach churned with unease. She decided to confront the innkeeper, needing reassurance, or at least an explanation. The lobby was deserted when she arrived, the front desk abandoned. The warm light that had drawn her in earlier now seemed harsh, casting deep shadows across the room. Leah called out, but there was no response. As she turned to leave, something on the desk caught her eye, a dusty guestbook. Curious, she flipped it open. The pages were filled with names, dates, and comments, all written in careful script. But as she scanned them, she noticed something unsettling. The last recorded guest had stayed at the inn in 1987. A chill ran down her spine. She flipped to the most recent entry, written in faded ink. Leah, room 7, November 20th, 2024. Her breath caught. The ink was still wet. A sudden noise behind her made her spin around. The innkeeper stood at the bottom of the stairs, her expression unreadable. "Did you enjoy your stay?" she asked, her voice calm but icy. Leah's mouth went dry. "What is this place?" she demanded, backing away. The woman tilted her head. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly. "No one does anymore." The lights flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist. Leah bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, screaming, but the innkeeper's voice rose above the storm outside. "It's too late. You're one of us now." The world around Leah seemed to dissolve, the walls and furniture melting into darkness. When she woke, she was back in room 7. The bed was neatly made, her belongings gone. A single candle flickered on the nightstand, casting faint light on a new brass key lying beside it. The key read, "Room 8." The whispers began again, louder this time, coming from the hallway and from within the walls. Evan had always hated the woods behind his grandmother's house. Even as a child, they felt wrong, too quiet, too dark, even during the day. His grandmother would tell him stories about the Watcher, a spirit that lived among the trees, but he always assumed they were just tales meant to keep him from wandering too far. Now, years later, his grandmother was gone, and the house was his. It was a simple place, nestled on the edge of the forest, but he figured it would be a good retreat to clear his mind. He arrived late in the afternoon and spent the evening unpacking, trying to ignore the unease creeping in as the sun dipped below the horizon. By nightfall, the woods were pitch black, their shadows pressing against the windows like a living thing. Evan locked the doors and tried to settle in for the night, but sleep wouldn't come. The house creaked and groaned in the stillness, noises he tried to dismiss as just the quirks of an old home. At around midnight, he heard it, a soft tapping at the back door. It was faint, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. He froze, his heart pounding. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and he hadn't seen a single soul since he'd arrived. He grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the back of the house. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. When he reached the door, he hesitated. The porch light was off, and the window in the door revealed only darkness. He shone his flashlight through the glass, but the beam barely penetrated the night. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. The tapping stopped. For a long moment there was nothing. No wind, no crickets, no movement, just an oppressive silence. Then, from deeper in the woods, a low, raspy voice called back, "Come outside." Evan's blood ran cold. He stumbled back, slamming the door shut and locking it. He checked the other windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The voice came again, closer this time. "Come outside." His flashlight flickered, and the house seemed to darken around him. He could hear movement now, branches snapping, leaves crunching. Whatever was out there was circling the house. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead. Panic clawed at his chest as he backed into the living room. Suddenly, the tapping returned, this time at the front door. It wasn't just tapping now. It was more deliberate, heavier, as though someone or something was raking long fingers down the wood. He couldn't bring himself to look. He turned off the flashlight and huddled in the corner, hoping the darkness would hide him. The voice spoke again, now impossibly close. It didn't come from the doors or windows. It came from inside the house. "Why won't you come outside?" Evan's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, the dim light of the moon filtering through the curtains just enough to illuminate the room. A figure stood in the corner, its shape unnaturally tall and thin. Its face was obscured, but its eyes gleamed faintly in the darkness. It stepped toward him, its movements slow and deliberate. Evan scrambled backward, his heart hammering, but there was nowhere to go. The figure crouched low, tilting its head as if studying him. Its voice was a whisper now, crawling under his skin. "You don't belong here." Before he could scream, everything went black. The next morning, a hiker found the house with the front door ajar. The interior was untouched, save for deep, claw-like scratches on the back door and strange symbols carved into the walls. Evan was never seen again. Locals say that the woods claimed him, just like they had others before him. And at night, if you stand on the edge of the forest, you can still hear the voice of the watcher softly calling, "Come outside." It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Claire and her friends had rented a remote cabin deep in the mountains to disconnect and unwind. No cell service, no distractions, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the crackle of a fire. It sounded perfect. The first day passed uneventfully. They unpacked, explored the nearby trails, and laughed late into the night around the fire. But as the flames died down and the forest grew quieter, Claire felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint, just a sense that the silence was too complete, too deliberate. That night she woke to a faint noise, a scraping sound, soft but persistent, coming from outside her bedroom window. Claire froze in bed, her heart pounding. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere. Who or what could possibly be out there? She slid out of bed, careful not to wake her friends in the other rooms, and crept to the window. The moonlight illuminated the clearing outside, casting long shadows from the surrounding trees. At first she saw nothing, but then movement at the edge of the forest caught her eye. A figure stood just beyond the tree line. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but it was tall, impossibly so, and its limbs were unnaturally thin. It didn't move, just stood there, staring in the direction of the cabin. Claire stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She told herself it was a trick of the light, her eyes playing tricks on her in the dark. She climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin, and tried to convince herself she'd imagined it. The next morning, she hesitated to mention it to her friends. She didn't want to sound paranoid. But when they went outside to explore, Claire froze in her tracks. There were footprints in the dirt, long, deep impressions, far larger than any human could make. They led from the edge of the forest to the cabin, stopping just beneath her window. Her friends laughed it off, blaming it on a bear, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. She spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every rustle of leaves or snapping branch. That night, the unease turned into outright terror. The scraping returned, louder this time, and it wasn't just at her window. It was at every window in the cabin. The sound moved methodically, circling the house. Her friends woke, whispering nervously as they listened to the noise. One of them, Jake, grabbed a flashlight and headed to the front door, determined to prove it was nothing. "Don't open it," Claire hissed, but he waved her off. As soon as Jake stepped outside, the flashlight beam swept across the clearing. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then the light flickered, and Jake let out a strangled scream. Claire and the others rushed to the door, but by the time they got there, Jake was gone. The flashlight lay on the ground, its beam flickering weakly. The footprints were back, leading into the woods, deeper and deeper into the darkness. Panic set in. They locked the doors and windows, barricading themselves inside. The scraping continued, growing more insistent, more frantic. And then came the whispers. Faint at first, then louder, a chorus of voices speaking in a language none of them understood. Claire backed into the corner of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, inside the walls, beneath the floor, even from their own shadows. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. In the pitch darkness, Claire could barely make out her friends huddled nearby. The whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Then came the knock. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, it echoed through the cabin. The front door shuddered with each impact, but it didn't break. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The scraping, the whispers, all of it ceased. The The cabin was still. Morning came, and the light revealed what the darkness had hidden. The front door was intact, but the outside was covered in deep gouges, as though something had tried to claw its way inside. Jake was never found, and the others refused to speak of what had happened. Claire left the cabin that morning and never returned, but sometimes in the middle of the night, she swears she hears it again, that scraping sound, just outside her bedroom window. The rain had started just as Naomi pulled into the parking lot of the old motel. She'd been driving for hours, exhausted and desperate for rest, and this was the only place for miles. The neon sign flickered weakly. Pinewood Inn, vacancy. The building looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, but she didn't care. She just needed a bed. The lobby smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. A man with sunken eyes and a faded uniform sat behind the desk. His name tag read George. "Room for the night?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yes," Naomi replied, glancing around. The walls were covered in old photographs, but something about them made her uneasy. The faces in the pictures seemed wrong. She couldn't pinpoint why, but their blank expressions sent a shiver down her spine. George handed her a key with a rusty number tag, room 6. The room was as run down as she expected. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls white, and the bed sagged in the middle. But at least it was dry, and the rain outside was intensifying. She locked the door and set her bag on the chair, ready to collapse into bed. Just as she was about to turn off the light, she noticed it, a faint scratching sound coming from the wall behind the bed. Naomi froze, listening. It was faint, irregular, like nails dragging against wood. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the old building settling. But then the noise moved. It wasn't just behind the bed anymore, it was traveling along the wall, slow and deliberate, stopping near the closet. Her pulse quickened. She stood and walked to the closet, gripping the knob with a shaking hand. Slowly, she opened it. Empty. Just a few wire hangers swaying slightly, likely from her movement. She shut the closet and turned back to the bed, but stopped cold. The chair where she'd left her bag was empty. The bag was gone. Her breath hitched as she scanned the room. The bag sat now on the floor near the bathroom door, tipped over as though it had been dropped. Naomi's stomach churned. She hadn't moved it. The scratching returned, louder now, coming from the bathroom. It wasn't the walls this time. It was the door. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, but the scratching stopped. Gathering her courage, Naomi stepped toward the door and pushed it open. The bathroom was empty. She flipped the light switch, and the dim bulb buzzed to life. The mirror was fogged over, though she hadn't used the shower. She reached out and wiped it with her sleeve, revealing her reflection. And someone standing behind her. Naomi screamed and spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Her heart raced as she stumbled back into the bedroom. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. She fumbled with her phone, but there was no signal. Suddenly, the scratching started again, this time from inside the closet, louder, more frantic. Naomi backed away as the door rattled violently, as though something inside was trying to get out. Then it stopped. The silence was suffocating. She stared at the closet, expecting the door to burst open at any moment, but it didn't. Instead, the light in her room went out, plunging her into darkness. In the pitch black, she heard it again. The scratching, but now it was coming from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere at once. And then a voice, low and rasping, whispered in her ear, "You shouldn't have stayed." Naomi bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She banged on it, screaming for help, but her cries were swallowed by the howling wind outside. The room grew colder, and the voice came again, this time from every direction. "You're one of us now." The walls began to move, bulging inward as though something was trying to push through. Shadows stretched across the room, forming shapes, faces, hands, all pressing against the wallpaper as if they were trapped inside. The last thing Naomi saw was the closet door slowly creaking open, revealing nothing but an endless, gaping darkness. By morning, room 6 was empty. The bed was made, the closet door ajar, and Naomi's car still parked in the lot. George, the desk clerk, smiled faintly as he replaced the key on its hook, ready for the next traveler to arrive.